Alrighty, we're going to get started on the economy and the Trumponomics. It's time for Trumponomics. Thank you. My name's John Kunkel. I'm the Senior Economics Advisor at the United States Study Centre, former Chief of Staff to Scott Morrison. My real connection probably, though, is I, about 30 years ago, did a PhD on US-Japan trade relations, so I've sort of come full circle. And in the meantime, I think my PhD's been translated into simplified Chinese, but it's perhaps a sign of the times while we're here that I don't think I'm getting any royalties out of that publication. But look, it's my great pleasure to introduce Kristen Silverberg, who will lead this next 20 minutes in a conversation about what we can expect really out of the Trump administration's economic agenda, obviously also picking up the congressional dimension, which will be very important. Kristen, welcoming her back, is the president of the Business Roundtable, the senior business body in the United States at CEO level. She's been US ambassador to the European Union from 2008 to 2009. She's had senior roles in the White House and the State Department, so I'm happy to invite Kristen back for this conversation. Well, I think, Kristen, before we get into the nitty-gritty, it's probably just good for the audience to understand a little bit about the Business Roundtable and the body that you represent and lead, in terms of its makeup, and in terms of, I guess, the way it operates, in terms of the Washington madhouse, if you like.
Great. Well, Business Roundtable is an association of about 230 CEOs of large U.S. companies. So lots of companies you know about, Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan, or Mary Barra of General Motors, Tim Cook of Apple. And BRT is really their forum for helping to advocate on economic policy that they think will be in the long-term interests of the United States. All of those companies do a lot of advocacy around their own parochial issues, and they work with some sector-specific trade associations, but BRT is when they come together, leave behind their parochial interest, and advocate on things that they think will support a strong U.S. economy in the long term. The CEOs come into Washington 4 times a year, so we'll have big groups of them with senior policymakers. They run committees on lots of issues, tax, trade, permitting, energy, and so on. And they spend a lot of time kind of thinking about hashing through common pain points, issues that they're dealing with in terms of the US-China relationship or in terms of permitting reform or other things.
Great. So look, let's jump into trade, because it's been, I think, it's of singular importance to Australia, obviously, but it's also been a theme throughout the day. And earlier in the day, you talked about the likelihood of some sort of form of universal baseline tariff measure of between 10 and 20%, with a robust exclusion process. So do you want to just maybe game that out for us a little bit? What sort of legal authority, how many hoops does the president have to go through to do this? Is it something he does on day one? And then what's the role of Congress in this, how this plays out?
Well, just to take a step back, I think it's worth thinking about what the administration is trying to do with tariff policy, and I think of it in a couple different buckets. So on the one hand, they want to use tariffs as negotiating leverage to bring other countries to the table to negotiate concessions. And this is very similar to what we saw in the first Trump administration with the Section 301 tariffs against China, which the administration used to negotiate this phase 1 trade deal. We'll certainly see something like that. We could see, more of that with China. You could see tariffs against Mexico as a way of getting Mexico to the table around some immigration issues. So that's a piece of it. What I think is the much more important and consequential piece is the Trump administration's ambition to use tariffs as a way of resetting kind of the global trade balances. They have a theory, a view that basically heavy use of subsidies, industrial policy in other parts of the world have created these persistent imbalances that they've put the U.S. permanently in the position of a trade deficit country, and that they can use tariffs to kind of reset those arrangements. And if you think about it that way, they have to be on for a very long time. They have to be global, or nearly global. And so to me, that debate over how do you use tariffs to kind of reset trade imbalances is really the most important thing to understand about the Trump administration trade strategy. They also have kind of a third ulterior motive, which is, by the way, if we could capture some revenues and use that to pay for the tax bill, that would be great too. But really, most of the action, I think, is going to be around this, this broader kind of structural issue.
And this is something, I mean, we haven't seen Robert Lighthizer announced into a role, and it may well be that he's not, based on this morning's announcement, but it's been something he's written about. So in a sense, it's something that's not only there to change China's behaviour, it's there to change Germany's behaviour, it's there to change a lot of countries'
Absolutely,
behaviour.
and it's there to change the behavior of U.S. companies. I mean, that's the other piece of it, is some of it, this is, you know, as I mentioned, leverage against other countries. Some of it is to create incentives for U.S. companies to move supply chains home. And that's, you know, because of all these complicated issues, I'm not confident this is a day one thing. I think they actually are still grappling with some of the issues, how they do this, what the exclusion process looks like, the legal authority. It could be, you know, there's a very open-ended statute called IEPA, the Emergency Economic Powers Act, which gives the president very broad authority to do things, typically sanctions, in the event of an unusual or extraordinary emergency, and they're toying with that. So I think they are still grappling with a lot of pieces of it, but I have a high degree of confidence they're going to move forward.
And
on
the
some
exclusion
version.
process would likely be both at a country level and a product level. So there'd be a process where, you know, if there's particular inputs that are critical to US manufacturing, then that would be taken account. In a sense, that's not all that different from some of the measures the Biden administration's been doing, whether it's on export controls or even tariffs in this last year as well.
Yeah, and we saw this play out in the first Trump administration, a lot of kind of heavy advocacy from companies about getting out from under the 301. It's different because the baseline will be so much broader, I expect, but there'll be some process for essentially getting countries or kind of product lines excluded.
Let's switch to what you might call as the more traditional Republican agenda on taxes and deregulation, and it's pretty clear that that was a signature element of Trump Mark I, and it will be again. How do you see that unfolding? There's obviously a process of Trump tax cuts that's expiring next year, so inevitably, even if it was a Kamala Harris administration, there would have been a big tax battle, if you like, in Congress. How do you see the balance of that in terms of, people had talked about before, tax cuts going to the wealthier end, and yet you have this huge vote of the working class and the middle class for Trump. So how do you sort of see the balance between corporate taxes, individual taxes, and where that comes out?
So what the President Trump's major signature achievement legislatively in his first term was this 2017 tax reform, which essentially lowered rates on the individual side and for small business. In the US, most small businesses pay the top individual rate, but then also enacted this major reform of the way that corporations are taxed in America, and that basically, to make a very long story short, the bottom line was it lowered the rate, the corporate rate to 21%, but enacted all of this base broadening. So it was kind of a combination of a bunch of tax increases and also lowering the rate, and it produced a much more competitive tax system. The benefits were immediate and very dramatic. 20% increase in domestic investment in the US, wage growth that was the highest in decades. I mean, overwhelmingly, no more corporate inversions. There had been corporate inversions, you know, companies moving overseas for tax purposes, dozens a year, and they completely disappeared. And so President Trump, I think, is strongly committed to keeping elements of this tax plan in place, but pieces of it have already expired and then are expiring up until next year. As John was saying, Congress has to pass tax reform one way or the other, because otherwise middle-class tax rates, individual families' rates will go up. And so the question is sort of what goes along with that. The reason it's sort of material to some of the folks in this audience is because it's going to be extremely costly. just extending the existing law is about $4.5 trillion, and then President Trump has announced a bunch of other tax provisions that could double that. And this is coming in the context of really growing concern on Capitol Hill about our fiscal situation. This is going to be a deficit-funded tax bill at the end, and that debate is going to play out sort of over the course of the next few months when Congress passes a budget resolution. But this question of how much deficit, what is the impact of the deficit in terms of revenue, is going to have big impacts on inflation, interest rates, and a lot of the things that kind of global investors and our economic partners are following.
So I guess that brings me to another element which also gets talked about in terms of inflationary impact, and that's migration policy. Interested in then again current thinking in your group about how that unfolds. What's the view on your members? I mean, if it's 1 million people, that's a lot of workers. So how should we be thinking of that in terms of the business impacts and the capacity for business to deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, this is an enormous issue in the U.S. I mean, it's really hard to overstate what a big role immigration policy played in this recent election in terms of voter frustration with lack of enforcement of immigration rules. There are about 11 million unauthorized immigrants in the U.S. today, many of whom have been there for a decade, so very kind of well established in their communities, in many cases employed, tax paying, but also a big security risk. A very porous border, and lots of Americans watching this kind of border crisis unfold in the past few years, and this really, I think, was a big part of why President Trump won working class voters at such high numbers. There's no question that every administration deports lots of people. The Biden administration deported about 1.5 million, but President Trump has now called for mass deportation, and it's not exactly clear what that's going to mean. One thing it may mean is that the administration stops prioritizing kind of criminals or people who pose a national security risk and start going after people who are employed and raising their kids, some of whom are American citizens. So I think that's a big issue, and some of it is, they do start doing big workplace raids and things like that. So I think there are going to be some real restraints on how quickly they can do that. One of the big issues with migration policy is we don't have beds, buses, judges, detention facilities, and other things that would enable this. So I think this is going to play out over a longer period of time.
Can I just sort of bulk that up then? If we're talking tariffs, if we're talking migration policy, we're talking tax cuts, we're talking question marks about the independence of the Fed. Now, there's an Australian economist, Warwick McKibben, who's associated with the Peterson Institute now in Washington, who's done some modelling on this, and it's basically shown that you get growth, as you would expect, with a big expansionary policy taking off, but then these other factors accumulate in terms of higher inflation, and we've just seen what the impact of inflation has been politically, and then an interest rate cycle that then brings things down. So I guess I'm reminded a little bit of the famous James Carville quote that from the Clinton administration, that when I die, I want to come back as the bond market. So is the bond market the ultimate discipline, or the share market going to be? We've talked today about what the state of the institutions, the checks and balances, but is the check and balance basically going to be the market?
I think there are other restraints on the Trump policy agenda, one of which is budget hawks in Congress. I do think that's going to be a dynamic that they're grappling with, and they have a theory, the Trump folks, that the tariffs won't be that inflationary. I mean, they have a theory that you could see foreign exporters lowering their prices to try to keep market share. And fundamentally, even if it's inflationary in the short term, they say it's basically going to mean supply side growth, which is deflationary once manufacturing moves home. So anyway, I think this is going to be a big debate. Our own view at Business Roundtable is it's very risky. I mean, one of the issues, with tariffs is it's very easy to make a policy mistake, as the U.S. has experienced. So all of those things combined, we think are, a cause for a lot of concern.
And maybe picking up, conscious of time, this will be a little bit of a whistle stop, but get back to China, and we've seen the Biden administration adopt de-risking, in a sense to get away from decoupling, and people focus a lot on Jake Sullivan's speech of April 2023, but the same month Janet Yellen gave a speech that basically said decoupling would be disastrous for both economies. But where do you see the balance of decoupling and de-risking playing out, or is that again something where there'll be different camps within the administration, there'll be external forces, there'll be elements of Congress, and or do you see that there is an obvious hardening, and Kirk Campbell obviously mentioned it in the context this morning of the thing that probably worries him. We've had proposals to withdraw permanent normal trade relations from China, recommendations. So how do you see the China battle on the economic front playing through?
The Biden administration has been quite serious about de-risking on the technology side. And so in a sense, I think that's going to be continuity. I mean, there'll be increased focus, I think, for the Trump administration on competition around AI. So I think you could see kind of particular focus on that area. But I think it's continued de-risking around critical supply chains, things like advanced pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, and so on. To me, the issue around de-risking is going to be less about some dramatic change in U.S. policy and more what the enablers are for the business community. We did a big study on kind of the state of de-risking, and it showed that it's definitely happening with U.S. companies, but it's very shallow. It's limited to kind of a few sectors and very narrow, and that only a few countries, countries like Vietnam or Mexico, are really benefiting. And one of the reasons we think it hasn't proceeded more quickly is because of the lack of trade agreements with a lot of the countries that otherwise would be beneficiaries of de-risking. You don't move your supply chain if you don't have investor protections and intellectual property protections and all the things that a formal trade deal would give you. And neither the Biden administration nor the Trump administration is likely to solve that problem. So no matter how much job owning they're doing around the de-risking issue, the fundamental thing that we think would accelerate that is still missing.
And I mean, you talked about, if you like, fiscal hawks in Congress potentially coming back into view. Do we see trade in Congress coming back as a potential where, people are actually moderating some of these stances or pointing to vehicles that actually this is part of enabling and Congress has a role here?
There is support still in Congress, support among the, ag state members, as an example, for a more proactive trade agenda. And in fact, the China Select Committee that I think Stephanie mentioned earlier, one of their recommendations is the U.S. needs to start negotiating trade agreements. So it's not a non-existent issue. It's just to negotiate and pass a trade agreement, you have to confront a lot of difficult issues, including your own political base, and nobody has been willing to take that on. It would not completely shock me if the Trump administration initiated trade negotiations with a couple partners or even reopened some of our existing trade deals. There's talk about how do we take some of our existing free trade agreements and make them more national security focused. How do we enhance some of the issues around supply chains? How do we deal with government procurement issues in a way that can kind of increase our mutual national security strength and resilience? So I don't think it's impossible they'll do some of those things. But getting back to where Business Roundtable thinks we need to be, where the U.S. is really leading a global trade conversation about how we open markets, particularly with our closest partners and allies, I don't see that.
And I'm going to park some of the technology issues will come up in the next session, but just quickly a couple of issues. One on the energy transition. Obviously, President Trump's made pretty clear his view on the energy transition. But in terms of your membership, in a sense, I guess most Western democratic capitalist economies have seen this process over time, some of with forward-leaning legislative tools, some of which capitalism has shifted as well because they think that's where it's going. How do you judge that now in the United States with an administration that's obviously got its mantra on drill, baby, drill, but how do you see that? Is obviously is Paris under big question mark, but what about underneath that and the domestic process? And we also obviously know that the states have a very important role. California, for example, on vehicle emissions. So how do we think about the energy transition over the next 3 to 4 years?
I think, this isn't a shocker, but the Trump administration will make some big changes around energy policy. They'll lift the pause on approvals of LNG exports. They'll reverse some of the power plant emission rules. They'll do more offshore leases, all of those things. So I think in terms of our kind of domestic traditional energy policy, I think they really want that to go gangbusters. And interestingly, when they announced Doug Burgum, the new likely to be Secretary of Interior, they said he was going to do that both to support the U.S. economy and competition around AI. So it's interesting, they're really thinking of the energy thing as part of part of our competition with China on AI issues. But I don't think any of those things will stop what's fundamentally already happening in the private sector in terms of the green transition, in part because our companies are global and they're dealing with European regulations and other things. And two is lots and lots of private sector companies see that as a real opportunity for what's products that are going to be in high demand. And so there's just going to continue, I think, to be lots of investment and interest in that space.
So my last question is somewhat related, and it's sort of stepping back to the debate around ESG, so environmental, social governance requirements. And basically, I think, again, you've seen a process of the corporate sector leaning in, and I think your organisation's talked about stakeholder capitalism. ESG is probably a little bit different, and I might get you to explore that a bit more. But I'm interested in how you see corporate America on these issues, because, I've noted, listening to one podcast, that the issue that sort of brought Elon Musk into Trump's camp was really these socio-cultural issues. So how do you see your members navigating this much more complex environment where, whether it's through political polarization, whether it's through how your workforce thinks about particular things, how do you see, obviously some CEOs will take a much more high profile than others, and others will, as I think you see in this country, they don't want to be sticking their heads up too much on these issues because they're quite explosive. Is that the way you see it? I think that is right. We had in 2019, Business Roundtable put out a statement on purpose of a corporation, which is an issue that BRT had addressed kind of periodically since its founding. And the statement essentially said that if you're going to run a successful company, you can't just worry about your share price. You also have to worry about, are you investing in your workers? Are you keeping the trust of your customers? Are you supporting your small business suppliers, and so on? I didn't think it was a particularly controversial or woke statement. I thought it was kind of basic common sense. And all of our CEOs thought that as well. They all signed, CEOs from every place in the political spectrum all signed it. But it happened at the same time that there was this kind of growing debate about ESG, and in a sense, those two issues were conflated. ESG movement started with, I thought, was a pretty reasonable observation that investors need more information about companies, about their kind of underlying health to make an investment, that you have to know, do they have a climate resilience plan, and do they have healthy governance policies, and so on. But ESG became kind of a grab bag for something that anybody thinks is a good idea for society. And so the concept really expanded to include some highly politicized and controversial issues. And understandably, the pendulum, I think, is swinging back a little bit. So I think more companies are saying, look, I really want to stay out of politics. I want to stay out of kind of controversial social debates. I really want to run my company in a way that's good for my workers, good for my shareholders, good for my customers, and kind of leave it at that. That's fascinating. We could talk a lot more, but my colleague Hayley Channer is now going to delve a bit more into technology issues. So, Kristen, thank you very much, and you're on the next panel, I think.